don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello, and thanks for pressing play on this podcast episode, which is going to be a bit different from our typical format. Usually our podcast consists of me in conversation with someone, but I'm trying out a new AI tool that is absolutely wild as it takes a document, in this case a blog piece, and turns it into a podcast conversation. The blog piece that it uses is one that I published on November 8th of 2024 titled How to Make Inquiry-Based Learning Knowledge Rich. It does a really interesting job and is very conversational, although it does mention learning styles in a way that I wouldn't advocate for. And the way that they talk about the question formulation technique is also not how I would typically talk about it. But again, it's really interesting to use AI in different ways, and I think this is a useful one for those of you who would prefer to hear people talk about this instead of read the blog piece. We'll be sure to link the piece in the show notes if you're listening to this podcast without being on our website. But you can find that blog piece, again, from November 8th of 2024, and it's titled How to Make Inquiry-Based Learning Knowledge Rich on our website at wegrowteachers.com. Speaking of artificial intelligence, we also offer AI in education workshops. And if you're interested in that or any of our services, you can go to wegrowteachers.com and find the menu item for school workshops and services, and it'll drop down. And there you'll see project-based learning, differentiated instruction, inquiry, AI in education, and much more. And I'll just say a few words about this blog piece and what this podcast talks about. As many of you who might listen to this podcast regularly know, I have been exploring with a variety of guests the sort of false dichotomy between direct or explicit instruction, often aligned with science of learning advocacy, and those of inquiry-based teaching and learning and more progressive or constructivist educational approaches. I say that's a false dichotomy. Instead of either or, it's a yes and we should really think about how we embed and include rich knowledge into the rich inquiry process, and that's what this blog piece really tries to get at. I do believe that knowledge is important and is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And now here's that AI-generated podcast conversation. I'd love to hear any responses or thoughts that you have after listening about the blog piece, the podcast itself, or anything else if you'd like to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us again as we take a look at a topic that's super important to a lot of teachers out there, inquiry-based learning.
It's a hot topic for sure.
Right. But, more than just a buzzword, we want to make sure that IBL is actually effective. Like, how do we make sure it's truly knowledge rich?
Right. IBL with substance, not just, activities for the sake of activities.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is inspired by a question from one of you listeners.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, you were really curious about this idea of knowledge-rich IBL and how to make it work in the classroom.
A lot of teachers struggle with that.
Yeah. And to help us unpack this, we're going to be diving into this great article, How to Make Inquiry-Based Learning Knowledge Rich. It's by Drew Perkins, the Director of Thought Stretchers Education.
I'm familiar with his work. He's got some really insightful stuff.
Yeah, he really does. And one of the things that struck me right away was this question that Perkins asks right at the beginning of the article: why teach knowledge when kids can just Google facts?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It's something we hear all the time these days, isn't it?
All the time. Like, oh, just Google it. But Perkins really pushes back on that. And I think it's so important to talk about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a little too simplistic to say that just because information is readily available, we don't need to focus on building knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like saying, why bother learning to cook when you can just order takeout?
Oh, I like that.
Sure, you can get a meal that way, but you're missing out on so much: the creativity, the satisfaction of creating something yourself, the deeper understanding of flavors and ingredients.
Right, and the joy of cooking, too.
Yeah.
And it's similar with knowledge, I think.
Right. Just Googling something doesn't give you the same depth of understanding as really wrestling with ideas, making connections, and building a framework for understanding the world.
Exactly. And I think Perkins really hits the nail on the head when he talks about the importance of having a shared knowledge base.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like trying to have a conversation with someone where you have no common ground, no shared references. You're constantly having to explain everything, and it's exhausting.
And you never really get to those deeper levels of discussion and understanding.
Right, you're always stuck at the surface.
So what does that look like in the classroom? Like, how does that lack of a shared knowledge base play out?
Well, imagine you're trying to teach a unit on, let's say, the Civil War. If all the students are coming in with vastly different levels of background knowledge, some with a lot, some with very little, it becomes incredibly difficult to have a meaningful discussion. You're constantly having to backfill information, and some students might get lost or disengage.
Oh, yeah, totally. I've definitely experienced that. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. You need that solid foundation of knowledge to build upon. And that's where I think a lot of the criticism of IBL comes in. People worry that it sacrifices knowledge for the sake of engagement.
Oh, I've definitely heard that concern before. Like, oh, those IBL kids are just playing around all day. They're not actually learning anything.
Right. But Perkins really challenges that idea. He argues that it's a false dichotomy. Knowledge and inquiry are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they work best together.
I love that. And I think that's such a crucial point. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can have both.
Exactly. Knowledge is the fuel for inquiry. The more knowledge students have, the more insightful their questions will be, the deeper their explorations will go.
And the more connections they can make.
Absolutely.
It's all about building those neural pathways, right? Like creating a rich network of knowledge that students can then tap into and build upon through inquiry.
That's a great way to put it. It's about creating those aha moments where students suddenly see how everything fits together.
And those moments are so powerful.
They are. It's where real learning happens.
So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that balance between direct instruction and IBL? Like, how do we make sure we're providing students with both the knowledge they need and the opportunities for inquiry?
Well, I think it starts with being really intentional about our learning goals. What are the specific knowledge and skills we want students to develop? And then we can think about which teaching methods are best suited to achieve those goals.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about just doing IBL for IBL's sake. It's about being strategic and purposeful.
Exactly.
Sometimes I feel like, I don't know, I fall into the trap of prioritizing engagement over substance.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there.
You know, like I get so caught up in creating these like Pinterest-worthy activities that I forget to ask myself, are the kids actually thinking deeply about the content?
It's easy to get seduced by those shiny, engaging activities.
It really is. And I think sometimes we confuse behavioral engagement with cognitive engagement.
That's a really important distinction. Behavioral engagement is easy. It's just about getting kids to participate. But cognitive engagement, that's where the real learning happens. That's when kids are grappling with ideas, making connections, and asking thoughtful questions.
So it's possible to have a classroom full of kids who are busy and on task, but not actually thinking deeply about the content.
Absolutely. And that's something we need to be really mindful of as teachers. It's not enough to just have kids doing things. We need to make sure they're thinking things.
So how do we do that? How do we move beyond that surface level and get kids truly thinking? What are some specific strategies?
Well, Perkins talks about this idea of aligning teaching methods with learning outcomes.
Oh.
So are we aiming for surface level understanding, deep comprehension, or the ability to transfer knowledge to new situations?
I see. So like we wouldn't use the same approach to teach basic math facts as we would to teach students how to write a persuasive essay, right?
Exactly. And that's where I think a lot of teachers get stuck. They think it's either IBL or direct instruction, when in reality, we need to be using a variety of methods to achieve different learning outcomes.
So it's not an either-or situation, it's a both-and situation.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And Perkins also emphasizes the importance of direct instruction when it comes to building foundational knowledge.
Absolutely. He even references Rosenshine's principles of instruction.
Oh, yeah, those are classics.
Right, and they highlight the importance of clear explanations, modeling, and guided practice.
Which are also crucial for building that strong foundation, right?
Exactly. You can't just throw kids into the deep end of inquiry without first making sure they have the basic skills and knowledge they need to swim.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that's where the question formulation technique comes in, which Perkins also talks about.
Ooh, yes. Tell me more about that. I've heard about that, but I'm always looking for more, concrete ways to implement it.
Well, it's all about giving students the power to ask their own questions. Imagine you're starting a unit on climate change.
Okay.
Instead of just lecturing about the greenhouse effect, you might show students a striking image of a melting glacier, and then ask them, what questions do you have about this image?
I love that. It sparks their curiosity.
Right. It gets them thinking critically about the issue right from the start.
And it gives them ownership over their learning, too.
Absolutely. And from those questions, you can then guide them towards deeper inquiry and exploration.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We're laying the groundwork with direct instruction, then using IBL to help students build upon that foundation.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And along the way, we're using strategies like the question formulation technique to make sure that inquiry is truly enriching their understanding and not just busy work.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here already, but I definitely want to dive deeper into those specific strategies for making IBL knowledge rich.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's talk about the nitty-gritty of, how to make this work in the classroom. We'll get into that in just a moment, but first. All right, so we're back. We're talking all about knowledge-rich, inquiry-based learning, and, we just can't get enough of this.
It's a rich topic. There's so much to unpack.
Absolutely. We were talking about those awesome strategies for making sure IBL isn't just, a free-for-all with no real substance.
I want kids to be thinking.
Exactly. And I'm thinking back to, some of my early attempts at IBL,
We've all been there. It's a learning curve for sure.
Oh, tell me about it. I think one of the biggest mistakes I made was not being clear enough about the learning goals.
Yeah. That's crucial. You got to have that roadmap.
Yeah.
Where are you going with this? What do you want students to know and be able to do by the end?
It's like setting off on a road trip with no destination in mind, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of wandering around aimlessly.
Exactly. And that can be fun sometimes, but in the classroom, we need to be a little more intentional.
Totally. And even if you have a clear destination, you got to know where your passengers are starting from, too.
Right.
Like, what's their background knowledge? What are their strengths and challenges?
That's where those pre-assessments come in handy.
Oh, yeah. Those are lifesavers.
Help you get a sense of, where your students are at.
And then you can tailor your instruction accordingly.
Precisely.
Speaking of tailoring instruction, I think that's one of the things I struggled with most, differentiation. Like, how do you make sure IBL is meeting the needs of all learners? It feels like such a juggling act sometimes.
It definitely can be. But Perkins offers some really helpful strategies. He talks about this idea of scaffolding.
Scaffolding, yeah.
It's all about providing different levels of support to different students based on their needs. Some students might need more structure and guidance, while others might be ready to take off and explore more independently.
I think that's where having a good grasp of those different learning styles comes into play, too.
Absolutely. Visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners, they all approach learning differently.
And IBL can be such a great way to cater to those different styles.
Totally. You can have kids building models, creating presentations, conducting experiments, writing songs. The possibilities are endless.
And when you have those options, you see kids light up. It's amazing.
It is. It's all about finding those entry points that resonate with each learner.
Okay, so we've got clear learning goals, we've got pre-assessments, we're thinking about scaffolding and differentiation. What else? What are some other key considerations for making IBL truly knowledge-rich?
Well, one thing Perkins stresses is the importance of ongoing assessment throughout the IBL process.
Oh, yeah. It's not just about that big test at the end, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to be constantly checking in with students to see where they are, what they're understanding, and what they're struggling with.
So those formative assessments, the quick checks, the exit tickets, the conversations, even just observing how kids are interacting with the material.
All of that. It's about being responsive to their needs and adjusting your instruction as you go.
That can be tough, though, right? Like, it feels like you're constantly having to be on your toes, thinking on your feet.
It does require a certain level of flexibility and adaptability,
Yeah.
but it's so worth it when you see those light bulb moments happening.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think those moments are more likely to happen when we create a classroom culture that embraces risk-taking and values mistakes.
100%.
Hmm.
We need to create a space where kids feel safe to be wrong, to try new things, to ask questions without fear of judgment.
I always tell my students, mistakes are just proof that you're learning.
Love that.
And it's true. If we're not making mistakes, we're probably not pushing ourselves hard enough.
Exactly. We need to shift our mindset from seeing mistakes as failures to seeing them as opportunities for growth.
And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about IBL. It really encourages that growth mindset. It's all about the process, not just the product.
Absolutely. And it's about empowering students to become lifelong learners, not just answer getters.
So well said. And, as we're talking about all these big ideas, I'm thinking about the practical side of things, too. Like, how do we actually make this happen in the classroom?
Right, the logistics.
Exactly. Like, how do we manage all these moving parts?
Well, one thing Perkins suggests is backward planning.
Backward planning. Tell me more about that.
It's basically starting with the end in mind. You begin by identifying your learning outcomes. What do you want students to know and be able to do? Then you think about assessments will demonstrate whether they've met those outcomes. And finally, you plan the instruction and activities that will lead them there.
So it's like working backward from the finish line to create a clear path to success.
Exactly. It helps you stay focused and organized.
And it ensures that all the pieces of the IBO puzzle are aligned.
Right. Precisely.
I love that. I think that's going to be my new mantra. Backward plan. Backward plan.
I think it'll make a big difference.
I do too. So, backward planning, ongoing assessment, differentiation, scaffolding, creating that safe and supportive learning environment, it's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but it's so worth it.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, there's so much more to explore.
There really is. And, we can't forget about the teacher in all of this. Like, what do teachers need to be successful with knowledge-rich IBL?
Oh, that's a great point. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so we're talking about what teachers need to be successful with knowledge-rich IBL. What are some of the, the non-negotiables?
Well, I think first and foremost, teachers need to have a deep understanding of the content themselves.
Right, like you can't lead students on an exploration if you don't know the territory yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding the big ideas, the connections, the different perspectives.
So it's more than just content knowledge, it's like pedagogical content knowledge, right? Like knowing how to teach the content effectively.
Exactly. And that's especially important in an IBL setting, where you're not just delivering information, you're facilitating learning.
Right. You're guiding students to make those discoveries themselves, to draw those connections, to build that understanding.
And to do that well, you need to be able to anticipate those aha moments, those points where students might get stuck or need a little nudge in the right direction.
I think that's where having a strong repertoire of questioning strategies comes in handy.
Absolutely. You need to be able to ask those thought-provoking questions that push students' thinking, that help them see the content in new ways, that connect to their prior knowledge and experiences.
And I think sometimes we forget how powerful a well-crafted question can be.
It's true. A good question can spark curiosity, ignite debate, and lead to some really deep learning.
And it's not just about asking the right questions, it's also about creating that space for students to grapple with those questions, to explore different answers, to maybe even come up with their own questions.
Right. It's about fostering that culture of inquiry, that sense of wonder and excitement about learning.
And I think that's something that IBL does so well. It really taps into that natural curiosity that kids have.
It does. It reminds us that learning should be an adventure, not just a chore.
So well said. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, questioning strategies. What else? What are some other things that teachers need to be successful with knowledge-rich IBL?
Well, I think it's also important to have a good understanding of assessment.
Assessment. Yeah, that's always a hot topic.
It is. And it can be tricky with IBL because we're not just assessing rote memorization, we're assessing deeper levels of understanding, critical thinking skills, problem-solving abilities.
Right. It's about assessing those 21st century skills that are so important in today's world.
Exactly. And that often requires us to think outside the box, to use a variety of assessment methods, to be creative and flexible.
I think portfolios are a great way to assess IBL. They can really showcase students' growth and progress over time.
Absolutely. And they give students a chance to reflect on their own learning, which is so important.
Oh, for sure. And then there are things like performance-based assessments,
Right.
Like having students create a presentation or design an experiment or build a model.
Those are great ways to see how students are applying their knowledge and skills in real-world contexts.
And they're fun for kids, too.
Exactly. Assessment shouldn't be a drag. It should be an engaging and meaningful part of the learning process.
Okay, so we've talked about content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, questioning strategies, assessment. Is there anything else that's essential for teachers who are diving into IBL?
Well, I think it's important to remember that IBL is not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Oh, right. Every classroom is different. Every group of students is different.
Exactly. What works for one teacher might not work for another, and that's okay.
It's all about finding what works best for you and your students.
Exactly. And being open to trying new things, to experimenting, to reflecting on what's working and what's not.
And I think that's one of the things I love most about teaching. It's a constant process of learning and growth.
It is. We're always learning from our students, from our colleagues, from our own experiences.
And I think that's what makes it so challenging and so rewarding at the same time.
I couldn't agree more. It's a journey, not a destination.
So well said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about what IBL is, why it's important, and how to make it truly knowledge-rich. We've explored some specific strategies and discussed the key things that teachers need to be successful with IBL. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Just this, don't be afraid to dive in. IBL can be a little daunting at first, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Trust your instincts, be open to new ideas, and most importantly, have fun.
Yes, embrace the messiness, embrace the journey, and watch your students soar. And on that note, we want to thank you, our amazing listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into knowledge-rich IBL. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and feel inspired to bring more inquiry into your classrooms. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.